Buffalo soldiers. They're American soldiers. They're in the United States Army. Again, the first African-American soldiers were in the 1860s, with the American Civil War. And as time went by, of course, as the decades went by, these different branches of the Buffalo Soldiers were assigned to any number of jobs and campaigns and located in different places. I don't know the history of the Buffalo Soldiers that well, but some of the highlights include the Spanish-American War in the late 1800s, 1898, 1899, right in there. Buffalo Soldiers with Teddy Roosevelt when he went to Cuba, San Juan Hill, very famous, Rough Riders in San Juan Hill. Buffalo Soldiers are stationed in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, and then they were also assigned to the national parks. I had to learn some of this because, again, my training, my background in college was prehistory, Indian, Native American things. I don't know that much about the military organization, but for this presentation, we're going to talk about those Buffalo Soldiers who were stationed both at the Presidio in San Francisco, which is still there today, of course.
Forward.
Thank you very much. And also soldiers were stationed at Monterey, California. So in this case, some of the soldiers came from both areas when they were assigned. The Buffalo Soldiers were assigned to the 9th and the 10th Cavalry. Cavalry, how do I say Cavalry? Whoop, there we go. The other cool thing is a lot of these pictures are these guys when they're in the parks at Yosemite and Sequoia Kings. So these are 100-year-old photographs. So they were part of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, not Calvary, and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Cavalry, horse soldiers, right? Guys on horses with guns and swords and sabers. Infantry, we all know by definition, the infantry are the guys on foot. So there's both. There's foot soldiers and horse soldiers. That picture there is actually from Yosemite National Park, but those are some of the Buffalo Soldiers assigned to that park. The other part of the background I should mention quickly is, today I work for the National Park Service. That's the agency that takes care of the parks. Well, we weren't always around. The Park Service didn't come around until 1916. Before that, who patrolled the parks? Who took care of the parks? Remember I mentioned there was Yellowstone, and then Sequoia, and then General Grant, and then Yosemite? The Army. Congress assigned the Army. They said, oh, we'll send the Army to the parks to patrol, to build roads, to build trails, to put out fires, to do a variety of things. So that's why the soldiers were even in the parks for well over almost 20 years in this area. So there's a quick photograph. I hope you can see this well enough. Just to get you oriented, we are, right, well, there's Visalia, there's Porterville. Here's Sequoia Park, just outside of Three Rivers. Here's Kings Canyon National Park. When the soldiers are there, it was called General Grant National Park. It was very small. It was just this little teeny part. And here's Yosemite. So these are the three big national parks that these soldiers were assigned to. Again, this is the late 1800s, starting around 1891, right up through the early 1900s. And then eventually, when the Park Service came along, the soldiers were assigned elsewhere. Some of the things they had to deal with, some of the concerns that the soldiers had to deal with. Sheep. When the parks were set aside by Congress, the idea was you don't run sheep in there. It's not sheep country any longer. It used to be. You don't run cattle. You don't build roads. You don't build houses. It's for the people. It's a national park. So they had to run shepherds and sheep out of the parks in the high country. And there were thousands of these sheep every year that came out of the Central Valley, out of Visalia and so forth. Every summer, shepherds would run their sheep up into the high Sierra Mountains and eat the grass and then leave. And today we would look at it and go, wow, that really is not good ecology. But in those days, that's what people did. So the soldiers had to send the shepherds out, say, get out, this is a park now. Logging. Logging went on at great scale in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And this is a historic photograph just outside the national park, up near General Grant area. And just take a quick look at that. Here's a giant sequoia tree. Look at that giant thing. Cut into a big piece. Here's the guys for scale. And they're using horses and mules to pull these. And then there's steam engines and there's rails all through the woods. So this kind of logging was going on public land, legally allowed, but once the parks were set aside, then you weren't allowed to log inside the park. So they had to deal with that. There was another quick story. There's another use of the national park area, the area up near up near Three Rivers. Sequoia Park, before it became a park, I mentioned 1890, well, it was settled. Lots of settlers came and filed claims. One group was called, this group right here, the Cahuilla colonists. This is one of their their camps, their tent camps called Advance. And the idea there was this was a group of people who mostly came from San Francisco Bay Area. They established some claims on the lands up in what is today the Giant Forest. And they were a colony. They were a commune. They were going to live together, have their own government, their own money, their own business. And their idea was we can live better kind of by ourselves, if you will. And they had legal claims that eventually were probably, to be diplomatic, they had a legal claim that probably should have been upheld. But the politics were such like, no, we don't want the colonists up there. To sort of the politics of the time, we'd rather have it be a national park. So they lost their claims. But what they did is they helped build some of the roads and trails before it was turned into a park. Here's another use. Over 100 years ago, you would have been there, and you would see this place called Canoyers. It's up in Kings Canyon Park. And this is an in-holding. It was private land at that time, I believe. And you could hike in there or ride horses to go in the backcountry. People did that over 100 years ago, just like we might today. We might go up to go hiking, to go horseback riding, to camp in the mountains. People did that, and this was the place you stopped at to get food, to get fresh animals, to change horses, that kind of thing. So that was one of the activities that was no longer going to be allowed. It's a national park. It's not a business. Small map, just give you a quick idea. Here's the original park right there. Sequoia, well, Three Rivers is right about there, I believe. Sequoia Park is here, and then I mentioned General Grant National Park was very small, but it was a national park. So the soldiers had to go to both areas. There were trails that took you through the mountains at that time. Some of those trails are still around today. Now remember, this is 110 years ago, 108 years ago, long before there were cars. So if you were going to go to the park, you had to ride a horse and hike. To get across the mountains, you went along these trails. So it was difficult. It was demanding. Soldiers on duty. These are non-African American soldiers, but there were other groups of soldiers who were assigned to the parks, of course. I'm going to talk here in a moment about the summer of 1903 when Captain Young was there. But here's some of the soldiers, give you an idea. Here's the General Sherman tree. You can go there today. Here's a soldier on duty, on patrol. Again, these are all historic photographs from the archives. Here's one of the giant forest trees. I think this is probably a Sherman tree, taken over 100 years ago, 109 years ago now. Captain Young, the summer of 1903, I mentioned the soldiers were usually dispatched from Presidio, San Francisco, or Monterey. That had been going on since 1891, right after the park got founded. Summer of 03, the soldiers are going to come down from Presidio, from San Francisco. The guy in charge was a major, whose name escapes me at the moment, but the major took sick. He turns to the number 2 in command. Who's the number 2 in command? Happens to be this guy, Captain Charles Young. Captain Charles Young is African American, right? Captain Charles Young is the only African American officer in the United States Army at that time. This is an amazing story. He's like the only one. He was the 3rd African American to graduate from West Point. This is well, by this time, 1903 as an officer, but when he was in West Point, he was only the 3rd one. And you read his diaries, you read his letters, you read his biography, and we think we have times tough. Sometimes we think, oh, life is tough, life is rough. You read his story, you're like, wow, this guy toughed it out. I mean, there was prejudice, there was bias, there was sabotage, there was all kinds of things. He got through it. He came out as a 2nd lieutenant, worked his way up. He's now a captain. It's 1903, and he's the highest-ranking African American officer in the Army, the only one at the time. And he's given command. He's like, you're number 2, you're in charge. The major's sick. Take the troops, go to Three Rivers, patrol the park. All right? Now, at this time, the pattern is recognizable. People know that the soldiers come every summer and they put out fires and they kick out the sheep and they throw out trespassers. They do all that stuff. But they also build roads. And that had been going on for a handful of years. So Captain Young, with the African American troops from the 9th and 10th Cavalry, 24th, 25th Infantry, they know they have to build roads. That's their main job for the summer. They come out of San Francisco, way up here. This is actually one of his maps. So here's San Francisco. They come down what is today San Jose, 101, over Pacheco Pass, I think, that area, down into San Joaquin country. Somewhere on this map it says Fort Fresno, which I thought was cool. Somewhere it says Visalia. I think it says Visalia. Boom, up to Three Rivers, and here's the park. So they come out of San Francisco, they march. This is a big troop. This is wagons and horses and supplies and doctors and all that stuff. These are some of the photographs from that summer. These are some of the soldiers camping on the way from San Francisco. Don't know where, but we looked at that, some friends and I. It's like, well, these are eucalyptus trees, so it's somewhere up in that San Jose country. But there they are. They also branch off. Some of them are sent to Yosemite, right, which they hit first. Some break off. They're under orders. You go to Yosemite, you patrol. The rest of you come with Captain Young. We're going to Three Rivers. And this happens to be a cool photograph of the soldiers on one of the downed trees. Imagine sitting on a horse, sitting on a tree, standing on a tree. It takes a pretty competent rider. It's not me, Here's a cool photograph of soldiers coming through Three Rivers. Now, these are probably not the African-American contingent that summer, but this is from the files. And if you know Three Rivers, if you go there, if you go to the pizza factory, sit there and have a beer and a pizza, sit on the front porch, you look across at a peak called, just went out of my head, called something Peak. Well, there it is. You can recognize it. This photo is about where the pizza factory is today. I want to say Britain, but it's not Britain. Anyways, another shot. They're now in the park area. They're camping. Look at these old tents. Old tents, soldiers. These are African-American soldiers right here. One of them has a dog in it. I can't tell now if that's a dog. But they had camp life. They had all that stuff going on. And this was every summer. They spent all summer patrolling in the parks. They picked up on the road that those colonists I talked about. Remember I mentioned there were some colonists who had a commune who put in claims on the land, pieces of the land. Well, they lost their claims. They were thrown out. The area is now a national park. The soldiers come in and they pick up on the road. Their job is to finish that road. And today this is called the Colony Mill Road. You can hike it. But here's a historic photograph, not of the soldiers. But imagine this little narrow road going from Three Rivers off the North Fork Drive up into the giant forest. And it was built by hand, started in the 1880s. So they know that's their main job. Well, this has been going on for years, and the road's still not done. They're supposed to get to the giant forest. This is a photograph in that summer of '03 of one of the troopers on the road that had already been built. Here's bridge, railing. This is Crystal Cave Road. If you've ever been up to Crystal Cave, you drive right by this. So that's kind of I'm trying to set the scene. This is what they're going to work on, what they're going to deal with. Here's soldiers in the giant forest area, again, just to give you scale, big trees, small horses, guys on horseback. Here's the Sherman tree. Now, what happens is Colonel Young, or then captain, he eventually becomes a colonel, the highest ranking officer, African-American officer at that time, but he's a colonel, or captain, forgive me, he's a captain at the time. He's in charge of several hundred troops under his command. They pick up the road building and they punch it through. They finish it that summer. They make great progress. And everyone's like, well, that's pretty cool. Because there's a lot of doubt. It's like, these guys are on their own, they're going to do this. But they did, and they did more. So they finish the road, they get the giant forest. You drive on part of it today. Colonel Young, or Captain Young, looks around, and he writes this all in his reports, because he's an officer. He written reports every year, right? So I decided that too many people were coming up to that big Sherman tree. Here's General Sherman today. So he puts the first fence around. They build a fence. Not much to look at, but I was like, oh, this guy's thinking ahead. This guy's thinking about conservation. This guy's thinking pretty far out. It's not just building roads. Now the road's done, what else do we do? Well, we put in fences. We start protecting the resources that people are coming to see. He also, it's a quick side story, but they work on that. At the time, the people in the Three Rivers community were skeptical, to be honest, like, oh, how well would these guys do? The newspaper editor in Visalia, a guy named George Stewart, at first I think was pretty skeptical that much would get done. But in very short order, he recognizes all this work. It starts getting cranked out. Summer of 1903, he starts writing these articles and these editorials about, wow, you should meet Captain Young. This guy is bright and professional and charming, and he speaks several languages, and he plays several instruments, and I've gone up and interviewed him, and he's everything you would want in an officer. And this is a white editor of the Visalia newspaper in 1903 writing these glowing reports. So he becomes a fan. That picks up a lot of other interests. So I guess one point is that in the summer of '03, Captain Young and the Buffalo soldiers, you could say, proved themselves beyond any expectations. They finished that road. Then they're assigned another quick job, Mount Whitney. This is Mount Whitney. If you go there today, there's a little building right there. See that little spot? There's a building on top of Mount Whitney. That wasn't there then. There was a trail 106 years ago, 1903. There was a trail to Mount Whitney. You could hike it, but you couldn't ride a horse. So Mount Whitney wasn't in the park, but it was part of federal land. Captain Young, as some of the soldiers were assigned, now they finished the road to Giant Forest. Now they're assigned to go to Mount Whitney. This is 14,000 some feet tall. This is the highest point in America at that time. Since then we have Alaska, right? And Alaska's higher in places. But this is the highest point you could go to in the United States in 1903. So Captain Young and some of the soldiers go over there, and they're told to fix the trail, build the trail better so you take horses. Now this is difficult. High elevation, remote, takes days to get there. Well, what do? They hike, they ride over, cross through the Sierra Nevada. They establish some camps. They start working on the trail. Where do they stay? They stay at places like this. This is actually one of Captain Young's photographs. I think the soldiers it's a switchback. It goes up like this, back and forth. Right in here, it's hard to tell, but there's soldiers on horseback. Army Pass. You grab a map today, if you're a backcountry hiker, you see it on the map today. Army Pass, where did that come from? Came from Captain Young, the Army. They were there. There's new Army Pass today, but this is old Army Pass, the original Army Pass. This is on the way to Mount Whitney, one way to get there. So they work on that. This is the trail. If you went there, I happened to take this photograph in '06, but this is the trail going in. See these backpacks sitting here? Imagine this. You hike in here. To this day, you go around this bend, this corner, you go up to Mount Whitney. Well, they fixed the trail so by the end of the summer you can ride horses. George Stewart, the guy, the newspaper guy in Visalia, he picks up that story. He says, wow, not only did they finish the road to Mount Whitney, they built a side road over to Morro Rock, which you use today. They also went over, oh, pardon me, I misspoke. They built the road to Giant Forest. They built a side road to Morro Rock. They did all that. Then they went over to Mount Whitney and fixed the trail there. It's a tremendous amount of work in one summer when all the previous years, nothing of that scale got done, right? So suddenly there's a lot of enthusiasm. This is on top of Mount Whitney from early 1900s. It's not the soldiers, but it was rugged. Imagine going up there, hand tools, horses, 14,000 foot, thin air. You don't have thermarest pads, and you don't have a comfortable sleeping bag, and you don't have freeze-dried food, and you don't have GPS, and you don't have a radio, and you don't have all the stuff we would use today. You don't even have a flashlight. It's rugged, it's remote, but they did it. They pulled it off. But I'll give you an idea. So here's Colonel, this is cool. Here's the the road crew that summer. They hired local people, and they also did some of the work themselves. And it's hard to tell. Here's Captain Young right there. Here's Grandpa Welch. He's an old guy with a beard, looks like John Muir. He was active in the road construction. This guy named Britton, who's a prominent name in Three Rivers, he was a ranger. A guy named Walter Fry, he eventually became the superintendent when the Army left. And a guy named L.L. Davis. Let me back up. So there they are. But here's Captain Young and some of the soldiers. At the end of the summer, they're very proud. They've done all this work. Imagine, this is hand tools and dynamite and horses and wagons. So the newspaper guy decides they're going to have a party. So why don't we have a big celebration? This is all true. This is in a little booklet that I'll mention at the end here. So everyone's impressed. Everyone's happy. All this work is done. They're going to have this big party. Oops. So they do. And here's a photograph from the party. They go up to the Giant Forest. They invite all the local dignitaries. I mean, big shots from Three Rivers and Visalia. And apparently it was very well received. Now remember, this is an African-American officer in 1903. And he gets this kind of reception. At the end of the summer, it's like, wow, we want to honor you for your work. So here they hold this big banquet in the Giant Forest. They use these trees that are laying down. This is an actual sequoia tree. It's been laying there for hundreds of years. They put a big tablecloth on it. They put food, and they put bottles of wine and stuff. I think this is one of the soldiers here. And they have this big party, right? And it was by all accounts pretty successful. And then, somewhere during that celebration, someone says, well, we should honor you, Captain Young. We're going to name a tree after you. It was very common over 100 years ago to name giant sequoia trees after famous people or successful people or people you want to honor. So there's the General Sherman tree, there's the George Washington tree, there's the Abraham Lincoln tree, and these are still around today, of course. So the honor is made, is offered. Captain Young will name a tree after you. And it's, we've written accounts of his response. He says, in so many words, he says, thank you, but no, I don't deserve that. I'm a captain, I'm just doing my duty. I appreciate the honor, but he said, I would ask you not to name a tree after me, name a tree after Booker T. Washington, who was very prominent, a leader in the African-American community 100 years ago. He says, I don't deserve it. He actually says in his writings, if you think I deserve it in the future, that would be great, but no, I defer. Could you name, please, Booker T. Washington? So they do. They name a tree the Booker T. Washington tree, and there it is. And it's on the road to Morro Rock. You can see it today. There's the sign, big wooden sign that says Booker T. Washington. Then this part of the story gets a little embarrassing, but I have to share it. In the last time, so 1903, there's a tree in honor of Booker T. Washington. The decades go by. It used to be on the maps, but then we kind of lost it. We lost track of it, quite honest about it. So when my coworker, who was working on this booklet that I'll mention here about Captain Young, he's in touch with a university in Ohio called Wilberforce University, where Captain Young eventually taught, where all his papers are at today, his photographs. And he's communicating on his research, and he said, well, my partner's name is, my coworker's name is Ward. He said, Ward, we have like his photos of these big trees, and one of them says Booker T. Washington. Where's that? I don't know. Not in the park, we don't think. Well, we checked the records, and sure enough, it was in the park. We had lost it. We didn't know. The sign was gone, right? And it's embarrassing, but it's true. So in 2003, 100 years later, Ward goes up there with a photograph that got faxed from Ohio, 100-year-old photograph of this tree, this very tree right, pardon me, that very photograph there. He walks around the woods and he matches it up. He finds it. He goes, oh, there it is. So there it is. So what do? This is cool. He goes up. I'm not making this up. The nail, the big square handmade nail is still in the tree. The nail that held the sign up 100 years ago is still there. So it's embarrassing. The Park Service has lost track of Booker T. Washington. We didn't lose track of Sherman. General Sherman. We didn't lose track of George Washington or Abe Lincoln, but we lost Booker T, right? So the idea there was, that was 2003. We relocated the tree. In 2004, we had a big celebration and put up a new sign, new ceremony. Relatives, descendants of Booker T. Washington were invited and came out to the giant forest. Relatives of Colonel Young, he retired as a colonel, they came out and we had this great celebration. We had reenactors. There are groups today who reenact the Buffalo Soldiers. These guys came from Southern California, I think. And what's cool here is, very quickly, if you were fighting with the Buffalo Soldiers in the 1870s, you would have been wearing this uniform right here. The kind of classic uniform with a cowboy hat and suspenders. This is what you're fighting in the Indian Wars. Later in time, early 1900s, you're wearing this uniform. So it changes over time. So some of these guys adapted the uniform of one period, some the other period. But they show up, there's demonstrations, it's a great ceremony. So we had this big renaming ceremony. And then, I just gave away the punchline. Then, some of the leaders in Washington, some of the head folks at the Washington, D.C. office, the Park Service, go, well, we had this renaming for Booker T. Washington. We found the tree, we're happy about that. We look at the story again, and several people, their eyes caught on that part of the story where it says, Captain Young says, no, please, not in my honor, but in the future, if you think so, that wouldn't be so bad. So we named a tree in 2004 for Colonel Young. And there it is. That's the Young tree. Now today when you go there, there's a big sign, but there's some folks standing right here. Give you a scale. So this tree is on the road to Morro Rock. You can go to it today. There's a little trail to it. It's really cool. And from the Colonel Young tree, you can look across, and you can see the Booker T tree, which is kind of cool. So there it was. 101 years later, it came full circle. All right? And then here at the very end, I just want to show you, I get no credit for knowing much about this. It's all things I read. The research, the information I got from two of my good friends here, the guy I work with, Ward Eldridge, and then Shelton. Shelton Johnson is a ranger up in Yosemite Park. He's African-American. He has studied the history of the African-American Buffalo Soldiers. And there's two sources. I'll leave this up if you want to write it down. There's this one. This is the booklet that Ward put together. Summer of 1903. Colonel Charles Young and the Buffalo Soldiers at Sequoia. If you go online and just look up Sequoia Natural History Association, you can buy this online. It's a little booklet, costs like $4. This is a cool webpage. Buffalo Soldiers in the Sierra Nevada by Shelton Johnson, www.shadowsoldier.org. And there's a tremendous amount of research on there. So that's kind of the story, and it's here in your backyard. I guess maybe that's one of my points today is this is just part of the story of the parks, but it's one that honors African American Month, and it was, for its day and time, it was a tremendous story. In the end of, for those that always ask what happened to Colonel Young, his career went on for quite a while. He worked his way up the chain of command, became a colonel. Again, he was the only colonel in the Army at that time who was African American, who was not a chaplain. There were some colonels who were chaplains, like Colonel Allensworth, right down here, Allensworth State Park. But he was the only active duty officer who was not a chaplain, so he was in charge of a variety of assignments. He ended up, and in all honesty, it was awkward, because at some point in time, it became awkward. Well, where do we send Captain Young, Colonel Young? Who would we assign him to? He eventually became a diplomat. As an Army soldier, he went to Haiti. He worked on a variety of government projects in Haiti. He taught at Wilberforce University in Southern Ohio, where his papers are today. And eventually, he was dispatched to Liberia, in West Africa. And he died in Liberia, picked up, I can't remember exactly, he got ill. I was going to say a fever, but it's in the book that the Ward wrote. Colonel Young gets sick. He dies in 1922. He's only 58 years old. He dies in Liberia. His body is sent back to the Washington, D.C. area for burial and ceremony. And the newspaper accounts give you an indication of how well known this guy was in the African American community. Over 20,000 people show up, and just to view his funeral procession, his casket. And this is just in Washington, and I believe he's buried. I shouldn't even guess. I don't recall. He may be in Southern Ohio. I don't recall it. But he was very famous within that community, and very much a prominent a role model, a mentor. His story is carried in, at the time, is carried in many of the African American newspapers across America. They track his career and they write about it. And it's like, look, you can do this too, kind of thing. And maybe the extemporaneous last comment is, here we stand in 2009, we have our first African American president. Now, would Colonel Young have envisioned that 100 years ago? I don't know. I don't know if he was that optimistic or that pessimistic, but it's a tremendous, to me, it's a tremendous advancement that we all have lived through. I mean, that's our claim to fame. We lived when the first African American president was elected. And it's men like this who paved that way in a very figurative but a very real sense.